The wind hit the cabin window so hard that Mara Whitlock dropped her mug of tea, and it shattered on the wooden floor. She did not even look down at the broken pieces. Something else had caught her attention. Something buried underneath the roar of the storm outside. A sound that did not belong to wind or ice or falling branches. A sound that made every hair on her arm stand up. It was howling. Not one voice, but many, tangled together in a way that made her stomach twist. She had lived near the Kessler River outpost for 6 years, long enough to know every normal sound the forest made at night. This was not normal. This was panic. Mara grabbed her heavy coat from the hook by the door, her hands already trembling from more than the cold. She was 38 years old, with sharp eyes that had seen too much silence in her life and not enough noise. And yet tonight, the noise scared her more than any silence ever had. She had moved to this remote wildlife station after leaving a busy city job and a marriage that had quietly fallen apart, hoping the wilderness would ask fewer questions than people did. Most nights, it kept its promises. Tonight, it was screaming for help. She stepped outside into a wall of icy wind that nearly knocked her backward. Snow moved sideways, stinging her cheeks like tiny needles. The storm had been building for 2 days, and every radio report had told her to stay inside, to let the weather pass, to not take any risks. But the howling did not stop. If anything, it grew louder, more frantic, more broken. Mara's flashlight beam cut through the snow as she moved toward the tree line behind her cabin, following the sound down the familiar slope that led to the river. Her boots sank into fresh drifts with every step, and the cold bit through her thick gloves within minutes. She told herself to turn back, that this was not her job, that the Forest Service did not pay her to walk into a blizzard chasing sounds she could not explain. But she kept walking. The trees around her groaned under the weight of ice, their branches heavy and bent low. She had walked this path 100 times in daylight, in calm weather, with her dog trotting beside her. Tonight it felt like a different place entirely, one that did not recognize her, one that might swallow her whole if she made one wrong step. The howling grew sharper as she reached the ridge above the river, and Mara froze in place, her flashlight beam trembling along with her hand. Below her, through curtains of blowing snow, she could see the river, and what she saw made her breath catch painfully in her throat. The Kessler River, usually frozen solid enough to walk across in the coldest weeks of winter, had cracked along a wide stretch near the bend. Dark water churned where solid ice should have been, and in that dark water, she could see shapes. Large, moving shapes, thrashing against the current, struggling against the pull of the freezing river. Wolves. She counted quickly, her mind refusing to believe the number. Not one wolf, not two. She counted 7, then 8, then lost track as more shapes appeared through the blowing snow, all of them fighting the same losing battle against the ice and the current. Some had made it partway onto broken ice shelves, only for the ice beneath their paws to give way again. Others were further out, swimming in place, their strength clearly fading with every passing second. Mara's training told her to call for backup immediately. She reached for the radio clipped to her coat, her fingers clumsy with cold, and pressed the button. Static answered her. Then nothing. The storm had already taken down the relay tower on the ridge, just as the weather service had warned it might. She was completely alone, with no way to call for help, standing above a river full of drowning wolves in the middle of the worst storm the region had seen in a decade. For a long moment she did not move. Every rational thought in her head screamed that this was not her responsibility, that these were wild animals, dangerous even in the best of circumstances, and utterly unpredictable when terrified and freezing. Approaching them could mean serious injury. Approaching them could mean she never made it back to her cabin at all. But then one of the wolves let out a sound that was not quite a howl, and not quite a cry, something in between, something that sounded almost like a plea. It came from the largest shape in the water, further downstream than the rest, mostly submerged, only its head and shoulders visible above the churning current. Mara felt something shift inside her chest, a decision forming faster than her fear could stop it. She began moving down the slope toward the river, her flashlight now clenched between her teeth so she could use both hands to steady herself against the ice-covered rocks. Snow filled her boots. Her lungs burned with every breath of frozen air. But she kept moving, closer and closer to the water's edge, until she stood at the very place where solid ground gave way to broken ice and dark, hungry current. Up close, the scene was even worse than it had looked from the ridge. The wolves were enormous, far larger than any she had encountered in her years working this territory. Their fur was matted with ice, their movements slowing as exhaustion and cold worked against them. Several had stopped struggling entirely, simply floating, held up only by whatever strength remained in their trembling limbs. Mara's mind raced through every option available to her. She had no rope with her, no equipment, Nothing but her own hands and whatever she could find along the riverbank in the dark. She spotted a fallen branch nearby, thick and long enough to reach into the water, and she grabbed it without hesitation, testing its strength against a rock before turning back toward the river. The nearest wolf, a smaller one near the edge of the broken ice, was closest to solid ground. Its eyes found hers through the snow, wide and wild with fear, and for a moment, Mara wondered if reaching toward it would only make things worse. Wolves in panic did not think clearly. They could lash out, even at someone trying to help them, especially at someone trying to help them. She had no choice but to try. Mara knelt at the very edge of the unstable ice, feeling it creak dangerously beneath her weight, and extended the branch toward the struggling animal. The wolf's front paws found the wood, scrambling against it weakly, and Mara pulled with everything she had, her boots slipping against the frozen ground as she strained against the weight of a soaked, exhausted animal, fighting a current that did not want to let go. For a moment, nothing happened. The wolf slipped, sliding back into the water, and Mara nearly lost her balance and went in after it. She caught herself just in time, digging her heels into a crack in the ice, and tried again, shouting words of encouragement into the storm that the animal could not possibly understand, but that seemed to steady her own racing heart all the same. On the second attempt, the wolf's claws caught solid wood, and with a final desperate pull, Mara dragged it up onto the bank beside her. It collapsed immediately, sides heaving, too exhausted even to flee from the human now standing over it. Mara barely had time to catch her breath before the howling from the river reminded her that 11 more shapes remained trapped in the freezing water, and one of them, the largest, was still barely visible beneath the surface, running out of time with every passing second. She looked down at the wolf she had just saved, its dark eyes watching her with something that was not quite fear anymore, something closer to confusion, as if it could not understand why a human had chosen to help rather than harm. Mara did not have time to wonder about that herself. She turned back toward the river, gripping her branch tightly, and prepared to do it again. The storm showed no sign of slowing. If anything, the wind grew stronger, driving snow sideways in blinding sheets that made it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Mara's fingers had gone numb inside her gloves, her face burned from the cold, and every muscle in her body already ached from the strain of the first rescue. She knew, with a grim certainty, that 11 more attempts like that one would push her far past her limits. But turning back was no longer an option she could live with. She had seen the eyes of that first wolf, had felt the raw desperation in its trembling body, and she understood now that she could not simply walk away and leave the rest of them to the river's mercy. She moved further along the bank, searching for the next closest animal, her flashlight beam sweeping across dark water and broken ice. Somewhere out there, 12 lives depended on decisions she would have to make in seconds, with numb hands and failing strength, against a storm that did not care whether she succeeded or not. The night had only just begun, and already it felt like the longest of her life. She thought briefly of her late father, a man who had spent his own life working search and rescue teams in mountain country far from here. He had always told her that fear was not the enemy in moments like this. Hesitation was. Fear kept a person careful. Hesitation got people killed. She held on to that thought like a rope of her own, something to steady her racing mind as she pressed forward along the riverbank, scanning the dark water for the next shape that needed her. The wolf she had already pulled ashore had not run. It sat now a short distance away, watching her with wide, uncertain eyes, its breathing still ragged from the ordeal. Mara spared it only a glance before turning her full attention back toward the water, where the real danger continued to unfold with every passing second. Further out, she could make out at least 4 more shapes struggling against the current, their movements growing slower, more labored, as the freezing water sapped the strength from muscles never designed to endure such prolonged exposure. She knew, from years of studying survival conditions in extreme cold, that an animal this size might last only a handful of minutes once true hypothermia set in. Every second she spent standing still cost one of them precious time they did not have to spare. The storm seemed to sense her resolve and answered with renewed fury, driving snow into her eyes until she could barely make out the shapes ahead of her. She wiped her face roughly with the back of one gloved hand and forced herself to keep moving, testing the ground beneath her boots with each step before trusting it with her full weight. One wrong step onto unstable ice could end everything in an instant, not just for the wolves still trapped in the water, but for her as well. As she drew closer to the second struggling animal, she noticed something odd. Instead of thrashing wildly the way she expected a panicked wild creature to behave, this wolf seemed to be conserving its strength, treading water with slow, deliberate movements, as though some part of its instinct understood that wild panic would only hasten its own end. It was a small detail, easy to overlook in the chaos of the moment, but it lodged itself in the back of Mara's mind, a quiet signal that these animals were behaving in ways she had not expected. She reached the water's edge and knelt carefully, testing the stability of the ice beneath her before extending her branch toward the struggling wolf. The animal's eyes, when they found hers, held none of the wild terror she associated with cornered or frightened predators. Instead, there was something almost searching in its gaze, as if it were trying to determine whether the creature reaching toward it meant harm or help. Mara held perfectly still for a moment, letting the wolf make its own choice. She had learned long ago, through years of careful fieldwork, that forcing an interaction with a frightened animal almost always ended badly for everyone involved. Patience, even in moments that demanded urgency, often proved the difference between a successful rescue and a tragic mistake. The wolf's paws finally found the branch, and Mara felt the current fight against her, with a strength that seemed almost personal in its resistance. Her arms shook with the strain, her grip threatening to slip against the wet, freezing wood. She planted her boots more firmly against the icy ground, took one steadying breath against the screaming wind, and prepared to pull with everything she had left, knowing that the night stretching out ahead of her would demand far more than this single desperate effort. The current released the wolf all at once, as though it had simply grown tired of the fight, and Mara toppled backward onto the snow with the animal's soaked weight crashing down half on top of her. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then the wolf scrambled off her and staggered a few feet away, collapsing beside its packmate, both animals now shivering violently but very much alive. Mara lay in the snow a moment longer than she should have, staring up at the churning gray sky, forcing air into lungs that burned with every breath. Her arms trembled uncontrollably from the effort of the two rescues already behind her, and a distant, practical part of her mind reminded her that she had barely begun. 10 more shapes waited somewhere in that dark water, and the storm showed no mercy, no sign of easing its assault on the land or the river, or the woman lying exhausted on its frozen bank. She forced herself upright, ignoring the protest of muscles that had never been tested quite this way before, and turned back toward the water's edge, where the next struggling shape waited, larger than the one before it, stranded on a shelf of ice that groaned and cracked with every small movement. Mara approached slowly, testing each step before putting her full weight down, aware that one wrong move could send both her and the animal into the freezing current below. She called out softly into the wind, though she knew the wolf could not understand her words. It was the tone that mattered, she told herself, the same steady voice she used with frightened animals she encountered on her patrols. Calm, low, unhurried, even when everything about the situation demanded speed. The wolf's ears flattened against its skull as she drew closer, and a low sound rumbled from its chest, somewhere between a growl and a whimper. Mara stopped moving, giving it a moment, understanding that trust could not be forced, only offered. "I am not here to hurt you," she said, her voice barely audible over the storm. "I only want to help." The wolf's eyes, golden even in the dim light of her flashlight, stayed fixed on her face. Slowly, cautiously, it stopped pulling away from her outstretched branch and instead pressed its paws against the wood, accepting the offer it could not have understood in words but somehow recognized in action. Mara pulled with everything her tired arms had left, her boots sliding on the icy bank, her shoulders screaming with the effort. The wolf came free of the water in a rush, sliding onto solid ground and shaking itself violently, spraying icy water in every direction. It scrambled a few feet away from her, then turned back, watching her with an expression that no longer held fear, only something like careful curiosity. She did not have time to marvel at the change. 2 more shapes struggled in the water further downstream, their movements growing weaker by the second. Mara forced her exhausted body forward again, her lungs burning with each breath of frozen air, her mind narrowing down to a single, simple goal. Reach the next one. Pull. Survive long enough to reach the one after that. The third wolf proved more difficult. It had wedged itself partially beneath a broken slab of ice, and every time Mara reached toward it with her branch, the slab shifted dangerously, threatening to crush the trapped animal or drag her into the water alongside it. She circled the area carefully, searching for a better angle, her flashlight beam catching the wolf's frightened eyes staring up at her from beneath the ice. She finally found a position where she could brace her boots against a half-buried rock, giving her enough leverage to push against the ice slab while reaching underneath it with her free hand. The cold water seared her skin instantly, a pain so sharp it nearly made her cry out, but she gritted her teeth and pushed forward, her fingers finding thick fur and closing tightly around it. With a final surge of strength that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her physical limits, Mara shoved the ice slab aside and pulled the wolf free in the same motion. Both of them tumbled backward onto the bank, Mara landing hard on her back with the soaked, shivering animal partly on top of her. For one terrifying second, she was certain the wolf would react with fear and lash out. Instead, it simply lay there, breathing hard, its weight surprisingly gentle against her chest, before rolling away and struggling to its feet nearby. Mara pushed herself upright, her hand throbbing with cold, and looked around at the 3 wolves now gathered on the bank behind her. None of them had fled into the trees, despite being free to do so. Instead, they remained close, watching the water, watching her, as though waiting to see what she would do next. It was a strange thing to notice in the middle of such danger, but Mara felt it clearly. There was an order to the way the wolves behaved, a discipline that did not match the chaos she would have expected from panicked wild animals. They were not simply a random group caught in a disaster. They moved and watched and waited like a unit, like a family bound together by something stronger than instinct alone. She had no time to consider what that might mean. The 4th wolf's cries pulled her attention back to the river, and she forced her aching body forward once again. This one had drifted further from the bank than the others, caught in a stretch of current that had not yet frozen solid enough to hold any weight, but was too wide for Mara's branch to reach safely. She stood at the water's edge, her mind racing through every option, aware that every second of hesitation brought the animal closer to losing its fight against the cold. Her eyes fell on a length of old rope half buried in the snow nearby, likely left behind by hunters or fishermen months earlier. She dug it free with numb fingers, testing its strength before tying one end securely around a sturdy tree trunk a few feet from the bank. The other end, she looped carefully around her own waist, giving herself just enough freedom to move toward the water's edge, without risking being swept away entirely. Then she waded in. The cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs the instant the water closed around her legs. She forced herself forward anyway, one careful step at a time, the rope pulling taut behind her as she reached the point where the current ran strongest. The wolf, sensing her approach, made one final desperate push toward her, and Mara caught hold of its thick fur just as her own strength threatened to give out completely. Pulling both herself and the wolf back toward the bank took every ounce of will she had left. Her legs had gone almost completely numb, her hands barely able to grip the rope, but she forced herself forward step by agonizing step until solid ground finally met her boots again. She collapsed onto the frozen bank beside the rescued wolf, both of them gasping for breath, soaked and shivering violently in the freezing wind. For a long moment, Mara simply lay there, staring up at the swirling snow above her, wondering if she had anything left to give. Her body screamed for rest, for warmth, for an end to the relentless cold that had settled deep into her bones. But the howling from the river had not stopped, and somewhere out in that dark water, more lives waited for a chance she was not yet ready to give up on providing. She rolled onto her side, pushed herself up onto shaking legs, and looked back toward the water. 4 wolves rescued. 8 more remained, along with the largest shape she had seen from the ridge, the one that worried her most of all. Mara untied the rope from around her waist, securing it instead to a second tree closer to the water's edge, giving herself a longer reach for the rescues still ahead. Her hands shook so badly she could barely manage the knots, but she forced herself to work slowly and carefully, knowing that a poorly tied rope could cost her everything in the moments that mattered most. As she worked, she noticed something that made her pause. The 4 rescued wolves had gathered together near the tree line, not fleeing into the forest as she might have expected, but instead forming a loose half-circle facing the river, facing her, as though standing guard over the rescue still in progress. It should have frightened her. 4 enormous wolves, watching her every move with intelligent, alert eyes. Instead, she felt something closer to reassurance, an odd sense that these animals understood, on some level she could not fully explain, that she was trying to help rather than harm. She had no time to dwell on the strangeness of it. The night was far from over, and 8 more wolves still needed her help before the freezing river claimed anything it had not already taken. Mara tightened her grip on the rope, steadied her breathing against the pain radiating through her frozen limbs, and turned back toward the dark water once more. She paused only long enough to glance at the 4 wolves already gathered behind her, their dark shapes barely visible through the blowing snow. None of them had made any move toward the forest, though the tree line stood only a short distance away, offering an easy escape from the danger still surrounding them. Instead, they remained close together, their eyes following her every movement with an attentiveness that felt almost coordinated, as though some silent agreement passed between them about what needed to happen next. It struck her, in the brief moment she allowed herself to notice, that not one of the 4 had so much as growled at her, not once, despite the pain and terror they had all so clearly experienced. She had handled frightened wildlife before, animals lashing out from fear and confusion even when help was the only thing being offered. These wolves behaved differently, as though something deeper than instinct guided their response to the strange woman working tirelessly along the riverbank. She had no more time to consider it. The wind screamed past her ears, driving needles of ice against every inch of exposed skin. And somewhere out in that churning black water, more lives waited on the thin, fragile hope that her strength would hold out just a little longer. Mara adjusted her grip on the branch, tested the ice beneath her boots one final time, and pressed forward into the storm, refusing to let her body's growing exhaustion slow the desperate rhythm she had settled into. Pull, breathe, move to the next one. It had become the only thought her mind could hold on to, a simple, brutal cadence that carried her through the worst night of her life, one impossible rescue at a time. The fifth wolf gave Mara less trouble than the ones before it, as though the animal itself understood that fighting against her would only waste the little strength it had left. It allowed her to loop the rope gently around its chest, and together, woman and wolf worked against the current until solid ground finally appeared beneath its paws. It shook off the icy water and limped a few steps before collapsing near the others gathered at the tree line. Mara barely had a moment to catch her breath before the sixth wolf's struggle demanded her attention. This one had drifted into a narrow channel between two large chunks of broken ice, its body wedged so tightly that every movement seemed to push it deeper into danger rather than closer to safety. Mara studied the situation for a few precious seconds, her mind working through the physics of the trap even as her body screamed for rest. She realized the ice chunks themselves were the problem. If she could shift even one of them, the wolf would have room to swim free. Using the same fallen branch from earlier, now slick with ice and dented from repeated use, she wedged it between the two ice blocks and threw her weight against it with a grunt of effort that tore at her already exhausted muscles. The ice groaned, shifted, and finally split apart with a crack that echoed across the water. The wolf, suddenly freed from its trap, paddled desperately toward the bank, and Mara reached out with both hands, grabbing hold of thick, soaked fur and hauling with everything her body had left to offer. They both tumbled backward onto the snow, and for a moment, Mara simply lay there beside the massive animal, both of them breathing hard, steam rising from their bodies into the freezing air. The wolf's chest rose and fell rapidly beneath its matted fur, and its eyes, when they finally opened, fixed on Mara's face with an expression she was beginning to recognize. Not fear. Something closer to recognition, even gratitude, though she told herself that was likely nothing more than her own exhausted mind, searching for meaning where none truly existed. She forced herself upright, her body aching in places she did not know could ache, and turned back toward the river once more. 6 wolves rescued. 6 remained, along with the enormous shape still barely visible far downstream, unmoving now in a way that worried her more with every passing minute. The 7th wolf tested her in a way none of the others had. It was young, likely not fully grown, and its panic had not faded even as exhaustion pulled at its limbs. When Mara approached with the rope, the animal thrashed wildly, nearly pulling her off balance and into the water alongside it. She held her ground, bracing her boots against a frozen root, and spoke to it steadily, her voice hoarse from the cold and the strain of the night. "I know you're scared," she said, her words swallowed almost immediately by the wind. "I am too, but I need you to trust me for just a few more seconds." Whether the wolf understood her words, or simply sensed the steadiness beneath them, its thrashing slowed just enough for Mara to secure the rope properly. She pulled with careful, measured strength this time, unwilling to risk another near disaster, and slowly, painfully, the young wolf came free of the current and onto solid ground. It bolted immediately toward the others gathered at the tree line, disappearing into their midst as though seeking comfort among familiar bodies. Mara watched it go, a strange warmth spreading through her chest despite the biting cold surrounding her, before turning her attention to what remained. 5 wolves left in the water, and the 12th shape, still distant, still barely moving. By now, Mara's body had begun sending warnings she could no longer ignore. Her fingers had lost most of their feeling, curling stiffly even inside her thick gloves. Her legs, soaked from the earlier rescue, had gone numb from the knees down, each step sending sharp needles of pain shooting upward with every movement. She knew, somewhere in the rational part of her mind, that fear had not completely silenced, that hypothermia was setting in, that her body was running out of the resources needed to keep functioning in this brutal cold. But stopping now felt impossible. She had come too far, saved too many, to turn back with lives still hanging in the balance. She approached the 8th wolf, positioned closer to the bank than most of the others, and found the rescue easier than she expected, the animal seeming almost too tired to resist help of any kind. It came free of the water with minimal effort, collapsing onto the snow and simply lying still, chest heaving, eyes half closed. Mara knelt beside it for a moment longer than necessary, checking that it was breathing steadily before forcing herself back toward the water. 4 wolves left, plus the 12th. Her mind repeated the number like a lifeline, something to hold on to as her body threatened to give out beneath her. The 9th wolf required her to wade back into the freezing current, the rope once again tied securely around her waist. The cold hit her legs like knives, and she gritted her teeth against a scream that wanted to tear itself free from her throat. She pushed forward anyway, reaching the struggling animal just as its strength seemed ready to fail completely, and hauled it back toward solid ground with muscles that trembled from the strain. By the time she collapsed onto the bank beside the 9th rescued wolf, Mara's vision had begun to blur at the edges, dark spots creeping into view whenever she blinked. She knew this feeling. She had read about it during her training, had warned hikers and campers about its dangers more times than she could count. Exhaustion combined with cold was a dangerous mixture, one that could steal a person's judgment long before it stole their consciousness. She needed to slow down. She needed to be smarter about how she approached what remained. But 3 wolves still struggled in the water, and the 12th shape, the largest of them all, had not moved in several long minutes. Mara pushed herself upright, swaying slightly as her body fought against the cold and exhaustion pressing down on her from every direction. She looked toward the tree line, where 8 rescued wolves now stood in a loose gathering, their eyes reflecting her flashlight beam like scattered stars against the darkness. They had not left. They had not scattered into the forest, despite every opportunity to do so. They were waiting. For what, Mara did not know, but something about their presence steadied her, gave her the strength to turn back toward the water one final time, toward the remaining wolves who still needed her help, and toward the largest shape downstream that she had not yet found the courage to fully consider. She tightened the rope around her waist, ignored the screaming protest of her frozen muscles, and stepped back toward the river's edge, determined to finish what she had started, whatever the cost might turn out to be. The wind had begun to shift slightly, no longer driving snow directly into her face but instead swirling it in unpredictable gusts that made every step forward feel like a gamble. Mara narrowed her eyes against the stinging cold and focused on the water ahead, searching for any sign of the remaining wolves through the chaos of white and gray that surrounded her on every side. Her thoughts, sluggish now from exhaustion, drifted briefly to the years she had spent training for exactly this kind of crisis. Long hours of instruction on hypothermia, rescue technique, and the psychology of panicked wildlife that had once felt abstract and distant, confined to classrooms and textbooks. None of it, she realized now, had truly prepared her for the reality of kneeling on cracking ice in the middle of the night, hauling animal after animal from water cold enough to stop a human heart within minutes. And yet something in her refused to stop, some stubborn core of resolve that had carried her through the loss of her marriage, the quiet grief of leaving behind the life she once knew, and now this desperate night beside a river that seemed determined to take everything it touched. She was tired in a way she had never experienced before, tired down to her bones, and still her legs carried her forward, one unsteady step after another, toward whatever remained of the pack still fighting for survival in the freezing dark. She reached the place where the 9th wolf had struggled only minutes before, and beyond it, further out where the current ran fastest and most dangerous, she caught sight of movement that told her at least one more animal remained close enough to reach, before exhaustion claimed either of them completely. The 10th wolf was an older female, her muzzle streaked with gray, her body marked with scars that told stories of a long and difficult life. When Mara approached the water's edge, the wolf did something none of the others had done. She stopped struggling entirely, and simply looked up at Mara, her golden eyes steady, despite the exhaustion clearly weighing on her body. It was as though the animal was studying her, weighing something in her mind that Mara could not begin to understand. For a moment, the two of them simply stared at each other across the churning water. Human and wolf bound together by a silent understanding neither could put into words. Then Mara extended the rope, and the old wolf reached for it with what remained of her strength, cooperating fully as Mara guided her toward solid ground. When she finally scrambled free of the water, she did not collapse like the others had. Instead, she stood, shaking the ice from her fur, and turned back to look at Mara with an expression that seemed almost deliberate in its intensity. Mara felt a chill run through her that had nothing to do with the freezing temperature surrounding them. There was something in that gaze, something ancient and knowing, that made her pause even as every instinct screamed at her to keep moving toward the wolves still struggling in the water. The old wolf held her gaze for several long seconds before finally turning and limping toward the gathering group near the tree line. Mara watched her go, unable to shake the feeling that she had just been evaluated by something far more intelligent than she had given these animals credit for. She forced her attention back to the river, where two wolves remained trapped in the freezing current, along with the massive shape further downstream that continued to worry her more with each passing minute. Her body had reached a point of exhaustion that made every movement feel like wading through thick mud, her mind slowing along with her muscles as the cold continued its relentless assault. The 11th wolf proved to be the most difficult rescue yet, not because of its size or the strength of the current around it, but because the animal itself had grown dangerously still. When Mara finally reached it, wading into water so cold it felt like fire against her already numbed skin, she found a wolf on the very edge of losing its fight entirely. Its breathing had slowed to something shallow and uneven, its eyes barely open, its body limp against the rope she managed to loop around its chest with trembling, clumsy fingers. Pulling it to shore took everything Mara had left. By the time she collapsed onto the snow beside the motionless wolf, her own body had begun shaking so violently that she could barely control her limbs. She knew, with a clarity that cut through her exhaustion, that the wolf beside her was in serious danger of not surviving at all. She could not simply leave it there and hope for the best. Something in her, some stubborn refusal to accept defeat after everything she had already sacrificed that night, pushed her to act despite her own failing strength. Mara tore off her outer coat, ignoring the immediate assault of freezing wind against her already chilled body, and wrapped it around the wolf's still form. She pressed her hands against its chest, feeling for the faint, irregular rhythm of its heartbeat, and began rubbing warmth into its limbs with movements that grew steadier as urgency overtook exhaustion. "Stay with me," she muttered, her voice barely more than a whisper against the howling wind. "You've come this far. Don't give up now." She worked for several long minutes, her own body temperature dropping dangerously as she sacrificed the last of her coat's warmth for the sake of the dying animal beneath her hands. Slowly, gradually, she felt the wolf's breathing begin to steady, its chest rising with slightly more strength, its limbs twitching with the first signs of returning consciousness. When its eyes finally opened, weak but alert, Mara felt a wave of relief so powerful it nearly brought her to tears. She continued rubbing warmth into its fur until the wolf managed to lift its head, looking at her with an expression of confusion and something else, something that looked remarkably like trust. She helped it struggle upright, supporting its weight as it took its first unsteady steps away from the water's edge. The other rescued wolves gathered nearby watched the scene unfold with what seemed like collective relief, several of them stepping forward to nuzzle the 11th wolf as it rejoined their ranks. Mara remained kneeling by the water's edge, her body shaking uncontrollably now without the protection of her coat, her strength nearly spent entirely. 11 wolves stood safely on solid ground behind her, watching her with eyes that reflected the dim light of her flashlight in the darkness. But one shape remained in the water, far downstream, larger than all the others, and disturbingly still. Mara knew, even through the fog of exhaustion clouding her mind, that this final rescue would demand more from her than any of the ones before it. She had nothing left to give, no reserves of strength remaining to draw upon, and yet the largest and most vulnerable of the wolves still waited for her in the freezing current. She pushed herself upright on legs that barely held her weight, retrieved her rope with fingers that had lost almost all sensation, and turned to look at the 11 wolves now gathered behind her. They had not fled. They had not scattered into the safety of the forest, despite having every opportunity to do so. Instead, they watched her, silent and still, as though waiting to see what she would do next. Mara looked past them, toward the dark shape still visible in the water downstream, and felt something settle deep within her chest, a quiet certainty that overrode every warning her exhausted body was sending. She had come this far. She would not stop now. Not when one final life remained trapped in the freezing current that had already taken so much from her. She began walking downstream, her legs shaking with every step, the rope trailing behind her in the snow, moving toward the largest and most dangerous rescue still waiting to be attempted. The 11 wolves did not follow immediately. They remained near the fire she had not yet built, watching her retreat into the darkness with an unreadable stillness that Mara chose not to dwell on. She needed every remaining fragment of her concentration for the task ahead, and she could not afford to let her mind wander toward questions she had no strength left to answer. The riverbank grew rougher as she moved downstream, jagged rocks hidden beneath fresh snow threatening to twist an ankle or send her sprawling with every uncertain step. She used the rope as a walking aid where she could, leaning against it for balance, her breath coming in short, ragged bursts that turned to fog the instant they left her lips. Somewhere in the back of her exhausted mind, a quiet voice reminded her that she had already done more that night than anyone could reasonably have expected of her. 11 wolves rescued, dragged one by one from a river that had wanted to keep them, was already more than most people would attempt in an entire lifetime. She could turn back now. She could return to the fire, tend to the survivors already gathered there, and let the 12th wolf's fate rest in the hands of a storm that had already taken so much that night. But even as the thought formed, she knew she would not act on it. She had seen the shape of that final wolf from the ridge hours earlier, had watched it struggle weakly against a current that seemed determined to finish what it had started. Leaving it now, after everything else she had endured, felt like a betrayal of every choice that had brought her this far. The dark shape grew clearer through the blowing snow as she approached, larger than she had imagined even from her earlier glimpse, its massive form barely holding above the waterline. Mara quickened her pace despite her screaming muscles, driven forward by a sense of urgency that overpowered even her own body's desperate need for rest. The walk downstream felt longer than it should have, each step through deep snow costing Mara more energy than she had left to spare. Her body had entered a strange state somewhere between exhaustion and pure determination, her mind narrowing to a single point of focus even as her physical strength continued to fade with every passing minute. The 12th wolf came into view slowly through the blowing snow, larger than she had expected even from her earlier glimpse on the ridge. Its dark fur, soaked and heavy with ice, made it difficult to judge its true size, but even partially submerged, the animal's shoulders and head suggested a creature far bigger than any of the 11 she had already rescued that night. It had drifted into a section of the river where the ice had formed a low, overhanging shelf, trapping the wolf in a narrow pocket of water beneath the frozen surface. Only its head remained visible above the waterline, and even that seemed to be slipping lower with each passing second. Mara's heart pounded as she assessed the situation, her exhausted mind working through the problem despite the fog of cold and fatigue clouding her thoughts. The overhanging ice shelf made a direct approach impossible. She would need to find another way to reach the trapped animal before it disappeared beneath the surface entirely. She circled the area carefully, testing the ice with cautious steps, searching for any point of access that would not immediately collapse beneath her weight. Finally, she found a spot where the shelf thinned enough that she believed she could break through it safely, though the water beneath remained a terrifying unknown. Kneeling at the edge of the ice, Mara began striking the frozen surface with the heel of her boot, each impact sending jarring pain up through her already numb legs. The ice cracked slowly, resisting her efforts, but she continued, driven by a desperation that overrode the exhaustion threatening to collapse her entirely. Finally, with a crack that echoed loudly across the frozen river, the ice shelf gave way, opening a path toward the trapped wolf beneath. Mara did not hesitate. She lowered herself into the freezing water, gasping as the cold closed around her chest like a vice, stealing what little breath remained in her lungs. She pushed forward through the narrow opening, her hands searching blindly through the dark water until they finally found thick, matted fur. The wolf, barely conscious, offered no resistance as she wrapped her arms around its massive body and began pulling with every remaining ounce of strength she possessed. The current fought against her, as though reluctant to release its final captive, and for a terrifying moment, Mara felt her own strength begin to fail completely. Her vision blurred, her muscles screamed in protest, and a dangerous voice in the back of her mind whispered that she had finally reached the true limit of what her body could endure. She refused to listen. With a final surge of effort that seemed to come from somewhere beyond conscious thought, Mara dragged the enormous wolf through the broken ice and toward the riverbank, her rope trailing uselessly behind her, forgotten in the chaos of the rescue. Her boots found solid ground just as her legs finally gave out beneath her, and she collapsed onto the snow. The massive wolf sprawled half across her own exhausted body. For several long seconds, neither of them moved. Mara lay there, staring up at the swirling snow above her, her body shaking uncontrollably from cold and exhaustion combined, uncertain whether she had truly succeeded or whether her own strength had simply run out at the worst possible moment. Then she felt movement beside her. The wolf stirred, its massive chest rising and falling with slow, labored breaths, and Mara forced herself to focus, to assess whether the rescue had come in time, or whether her efforts had been too little, too late. She pushed herself up onto her elbows, ignoring the screaming protest of her frozen muscles, and looked down at the animal beside her. Its eyes remained closed, its body limp against the snow, but its chest continued to rise and fall with a rhythm that, while weak, still spoke of life clinging stubbornly to a body that had nearly lost its battle against the freezing river. Mara knew she needed to build a fire immediately, both for the wolf's survival and her own. Her soaked clothing had already begun to freeze against her skin, and she recognized, with a clarity that cut through her exhaustion, that she had perhaps only minutes before her own body succumbed to the same dangerous cold that had nearly claimed the animal beside her. She forced herself upright, her legs barely cooperating, and stumbled toward the tree line where dry branches and fallen wood offered the only hope of warmth available to her. Her fingers, numb and clumsy, fumbled with the small emergency fire kit she always carried in an inner pocket of her coat, the coat she had sacrificed earlier to save the 11th wolf now safely resting among its pack. It took several attempts, her hands shaking too violently to strike a proper spark, but finally a small flame caught among the dry kindling she had gathered. Mara fed it carefully, coaxing it into a steady fire despite the wind that seemed determined to extinguish her efforts at every turn. As the fire grew, she turned back toward the massive wolf still lying motionless nearby, and dragged herself close enough to feel its body heat, or the dangerous lack of it, against her own freezing skin. She positioned herself between the fire and the animal, using her own body as a barrier against the wind, determined to give the creature every possible chance at survival. The 11 other wolves had followed her downstream, she realized, gathering now at a respectful distance around the fire, their eyes reflecting the flickering light as they watched the scene unfold. None of them approached closer than a few careful steps, as though understanding instinctively that the moment belonged to the massive wolf and the exhausted woman who had saved him. Mara had no strength left to wonder at their behavior. She simply held on, feeding the fire with what fuel she could reach without leaving the wolf's side, and waited through the longest hours of her life to see whether her final and most difficult rescue would ultimately succeed or fail. The storm continued to rage around them, indifferent to the small circle of warmth and life struggling to survive within its grip, and Mara Whitlock, more exhausted than she had ever been in her entire life, refused to close her eyes, refused to give in to the darkness pulling at the edges of her vision, until she knew for certain that the last wolf would live to see the morning. She lost track of how long she sat there, feeding the fire with whatever fuel remained within easy reach, her body shivering uncontrollably beneath layers of soaked clothing that offered little protection against the biting wind. Her mind drifted in and out of clarity, exhaustion pulling at her thoughts the way the current had pulled at the wolves only hours before. At some point, she became aware of the 11 other wolves settling closer around the fire, their combined presence forming a rough barrier against the worst of the wind. She should have found their proximity alarming, 12 enormous predators surrounding her in the darkness, any one of them capable of ending her life in seconds if their intentions turned even briefly hostile. Instead, exhaustion smoothed the edges of her fear into something closer to quiet acceptance. She had spent every ounce of strength she possessed keeping them alive. If they meant her harm now, there was little more she could do to prevent it. But they showed no such intention. Several of the smaller wolves pressed closer to the fire, their thick fur beginning to dry in the heat, occasional soft sounds passing between them that Mara found strangely soothing despite her exhaustion. The old scarred female settled a short distance from her feet, watching the flames with half-closed eyes. Her earlier intensity toward Mara, replaced now with something that looked almost like peaceful trust. The massive alpha's breathing continued to strengthen throughout the following hour, each breath a little steadier than the last, each small movement a little more certain. Mara monitored him as closely as her failing strength allowed, checking periodically for the telltale signs of continued distress that would signal his condition was worsening rather than improving. By the time the fire had burned down to a steady bed of glowing coals, the massive wolf's eyes had opened fully, dark and alert despite his obvious exhaustion. He lifted his head slightly, taking in his surroundings, the gathered pack, the dying fire, and finally, the shivering woman sitting close beside him who had pulled him from beneath the ice with her own bare hands. For a long moment, his gaze remained fixed on her face, and Mara found herself holding perfectly still under the weight of his attention, uncertain what to expect from an animal of such obvious size and strength, now fully conscious for the first time since she had dragged him from the freezing water. Then, slowly, he lowered his head back down against the snow, a gesture that felt unmistakably like acceptance, and closed his eyes once more, this time in what appeared to be genuine, restful sleep, rather than the dangerous unconsciousness that had gripped him only hours before. Mara allowed herself a small, exhausted smile at the sight, the first genuine moment of relief she had experienced since the entire ordeal began. Whatever remained of the long night ahead, she understood now that her final and most difficult rescue had succeeded. The Alpha would live to see the morning, and so, she hoped, would she. Hours passed in a blur of cold and flickering firelight. Mara drifted in and out of a haze that was not quite sleep and not quite waking, her body too exhausted to maintain full awareness, yet too aware of the danger surrounding her to fully surrender to unconsciousness. She fed the fire whenever her mind cleared enough to remember the task, her movements growing slower and more mechanical with each passing hour. At some point during the long night, She became aware of warmth pressing against her side. She blinked slowly, her vision blurry from cold and fatigue, and realized that several of the rescued wolves had moved closer, forming a loose circle around both her and the massive animal she had pulled from beneath the ice. Their combined body heat radiated outward, a natural warmth that the fire alone could not provide. She should have been afraid. Every instinct trained into her by years of wildlife work told her that sleeping among a pack of enormous wolves, even ones she had personally rescued, carried enormous risk. Wild animals remained unpredictable no matter the circumstances, and exhaustion could easily cloud her judgment about their true intentions. And yet, as she lay there in the flickering firelight, surrounded by creatures whose combined strength could have overwhelmed her in seconds, she felt something closer to safety than danger. The wolves seemed content simply to rest nearby, their breathing slow and steady, occasional soft sounds passing between them that reminded Mara of a family settling in for the night rather than a group of wild predators. The massive wolf beside her stirred some time before dawn, his breathing growing steadier, his body gradually reclaiming warmth from the fire and the pack surrounding him. Mara watched through half-closed eyes, as his great chest rose and fell with increasing strength, relief washing through her exhausted body at the sight of his slow but certain recovery. She must have finally drifted into genuine sleep at some point, because the next thing she became aware of was pale gray light filtering through the storm clouds above, signaling the arrival of dawn. Mara's body ached in ways she had never experienced before, every muscle stiff and sore from the night's exertions, her clothing still damp and cold against her skin despite the fire's efforts. She pushed herself upright slowly, her joints protesting every movement, and looked around at the scene surrounding her. 11 wolves lay scattered nearby, some still sleeping, others already awake and watching her with alert, curious eyes. The 12th wolf, the massive one she had pulled from beneath the ice, remained closest to her, his dark eyes now open and fixed steadily on her face. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Mara studied the animal before her, taking in details she had been too exhausted to notice during the chaos of the previous night. He was enormous, larger than any wolf she had ever encountered in her years of wildlife work, his shoulders broad and powerful even in his weakened state. Scars marked his dark fur in several places, old wounds that spoke of battles survived and challenges overcome throughout what must have been a long and difficult life. There was something in his gaze that unsettled her, an intelligence that seemed to go beyond simple animal awareness. He watched her with an intensity that felt almost deliberate, as though he were trying to communicate something she lacked the ability to fully understand. Mara had spent years working closely with wildlife, had developed an instinct for reading animal behavior that most people never acquired, but nothing in her experience had prepared her for the way this particular wolf looked at her, as though weighing her worth, measuring her against some standard she could not begin to guess at. She reached slowly into her coat, checking her radio out of habit, though she already suspected it would remain useless until the storm passed and the relay tower could be repaired. Static greeted her attempt, confirming her fears. She was still cut off from any outside help, still alone with 12 enormous wolves in the aftermath of a rescue that had nearly cost her everything. The fire had burned down to glowing embers overnight, and Mara realized she would need to gather more fuel soon if she hoped to survive the remaining hours until the storm finally broke. She rose unsteadily to her feet, her legs trembling from exhaustion and cold, and took a slow step toward the tree line where dry branches still waited to be collected. Immediately, several of the wolves shifted, their attention sharpening as they watched her movement. Mara paused, uncertain whether their alertness signaled concern or simple curiosity, and glanced back toward the massive wolf still resting near the dying fire. He watched her too, but made no move to stop her, no aggressive posture or warning growl accompanying his steady gaze. After a moment, he lowered his head slightly, a gesture that felt almost like permission, and Mara found herself continuing toward the tree line, with a strange confidence she could not fully explain. She gathered what dry wood she could find within a short distance of the fire, unwilling to venture too far from the pack, despite the odd sense of safety she felt in their presence. Her hands, still stiff and slow from the cold, fumbled repeatedly as she worked, but she pushed through the discomfort, driven by the practical necessity of survival. When she returned to the fire with an armful of branches, she found the wolves had shifted position slightly, forming a wider circle that somehow still kept both her and the massive 12th wolf near its center. It was a small detail, easy to dismiss as coincidence, but combined with everything else she had witnessed throughout the long night, it added to a growing suspicion that these animals operated according to a social structure far more complex than she had previously understood. She fed the fire carefully, coaxing the dying embers back into a steady flame, and settled down near its warmth to wait out the remainder of the storm. The massive wolf continued to watch her, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight, and Mara found herself wondering, not for the first time that morning, exactly what kind of animal she had pulled from beneath the frozen river the night before. Whatever the answer turned out to be, she suspected her ordinary life at the remote outpost was about to change in ways she could not yet fully imagine. As the morning wore on, Mara found herself studying the smaller details of the pack's behavior with growing fascination. She noticed how the younger wolves deferred not only to the massive alpha but also to the scarred older female who had watched her so intently during the rescue the night before. The two seemed to share an understanding that went beyond simple size or strength, a partnership built over what she suspected must have been many years spent leading the pack together through countless seasons and challenges she could only guess at. She thought about the isolation of her own life at the outpost, the quiet solitude she had chosen deliberately after the collapse of her marriage, the comfort she had found in routines that asked little of her beyond careful attention and steady discipline. Watching the wolves interact with such evident care for one another, she felt an unexpected pang of something she had not allowed herself to feel in a long time, a quiet longing for the kind of connection she observed so clearly among these animals. She pushed the thought aside, uncomfortable with its intrusion into a morning that already held enough strangeness to process. Instead, she focused on practical matters, checking her own physical condition as thoroughly as her limited resources allowed. Her fingers, though stiff and aching, showed no signs of the deep, blackened damage that would signal serious frostbite. Her legs, though sore and unsteady, still carried her weight without collapsing entirely. She had come through the night bruised and exhausted, but largely intact, a fact she credited as much to sheer stubborn will as to any particular skill or preparation. The massive wolf continued to watch her throughout these quiet moments, his dark eyes tracking her every movement with an attentiveness that felt increasingly deliberate rather than simply cautious. Mara found herself growing more comfortable under his gaze as the morning progressed, no longer flinching at the intensity she had first found unsettling, but instead meeting it with a steadiness of her own that seemed, in some way she could not fully articulate, to please the animal watching her. She added more wood to the fire, grateful for its warmth against the lingering chill of the storm, and settled back to wait out whatever remained of the weather before attempting the difficult journey back toward her cabin. Around her, the pack continued its quiet rhythms of rest and watchfulness. 12 extraordinary lives she had pulled from the edge of death, now sharing the same small circle of warmth and safety she had carved out of the freezing wilderness through nothing more than sheer determination and a refusal to abandon creatures in need, however dangerous or unlikely the circumstances of their meeting had been. By mid-morning, the storm had begun to weaken, its fierce winds softening into gentler gusts that no longer drove snow sideways with the same punishing force. Mara sat close to her small fire, watching the shifting light through the thinning clouds above, grateful for the first real sign that the worst of the danger might finally be passing. The massive wolf beside her had grown noticeably stronger throughout the morning hours, his breathing steady and even, his dark eyes alert and tracking every movement around him, with a sharpness that suggested his strength was returning quickly. Mara found herself watching him almost as often as he watched her, unable to shake the growing sense that this particular animal was unlike anything she had encountered during her years of wildlife work. She thought back to conversations she had shared with local trackers and indigenous guides during her early years at the outpost, memories she had not considered in a long time but that now surfaced with sudden relevance. She remembered an older tracker named Ellis Hartley mentioning, almost in passing, rumors of an unusually large wolf that ranged through the deepest and most remote parts of the territory, an animal locals had taken to calling by a name that had always struck her as more legend than fact. At the time, she had dismissed the stories as typical wilderness folklore, the kind of exaggerated tale that grew larger with each retelling around a campfire. Wildlife biologists rarely put much stock in such stories, preferring documented evidence over rumor and speculation. But sitting here now, beside an animal whose size and bearing exceeded anything she had previously witnessed, Mara found herself reconsidering those old conversations with newfound seriousness. She studied the wolf more carefully as the morning light grew stronger, noting details that had escaped her attention during the chaos and exhaustion of the previous night. His build was different from the others gathered around them, broader through the chest, more heavily muscled along his shoulders and legs. His dark fur carried streaks of silver near his face and along his back, markings that seemed to command a certain respect from the other wolves whenever they passed nearby. More telling than his physical appearance was the behavior of the 11 other wolves surrounding him. Throughout the morning, Mara observed a clear pattern in how they moved and positioned themselves. None approached the massive wolf directly without some visible gesture of deference first, a lowered head, a submissive posture, a careful distance maintained until acknowledged. It was a level of social structure and respect that went well beyond typical pack behavior she had studied and documented throughout her career. She recalled her training, the countless hours spent learning about wolf pack dynamics, the way alpha animals typically established and maintained their position through a combination of size, strength, and behavior that other pack members instinctively recognized and respected. What she was witnessing here seemed to exceed even those established patterns, suggesting a hierarchy so deeply ingrained that it operated almost effortlessly, without need for constant reinforcement or challenge. Mara reached for a small notebook she kept in an inner pocket of her coat, a habit from her professional work that had survived even the chaos of the previous night. Her fingers, still stiff from cold, fumbled with the pages as she began recording her observations, driven by a professional instinct that refused to remain silent even in the midst of such an extraordinary situation. As she wrote, the massive wolf shifted position slightly, drawing closer to where she sat near the fire. Mara paused her writing, watching him carefully, uncertain what to expect from this deliberate movement. He settled down a short distance away, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his massive body, and rested his head on his front paws, his dark eyes never leaving her face. It was an act of trust, she realized, remarkable given the circumstances of their meeting the night before. This animal, easily capable of overpowering her without effort, had chosen instead to rest peacefully in her presence, treating her with a level of acceptance that felt almost deliberate in its clarity. She continued writing in her notebook, documenting everything she observed with the careful precision her training demanded, even as a part of her mind struggled to process the growing suspicion that she had stumbled into something far beyond an ordinary wildlife rescue. The old stories she remembered, the ones about an unusually large wolf that commanded respect throughout the deepest reaches of the territory, suddenly felt less like folklore and more like distant echoes of truth. The storm continued its slow retreat throughout the late morning hours, the wind softening further, patches of pale sunlight occasionally breaking through the thinning clouds above. Mara knew that once the weather cleared sufficiently, she would need to make her way back toward the outpost, both to report the unusual events of the previous night and to seek proper medical attention for the exhaustion and mild cold exposure she had suffered during the long rescue effort. But leaving felt more complicated than she had expected. The pack showed no signs of scattering into the forest, remaining instead close to the fire and to her presence, almost as though waiting for some signal or decision that only she could provide. She rose slowly, testing her stiff and aching muscles, and moved toward the edge of the small clearing where the fire had kept them all safe throughout the night. The 11 smaller wolves shifted with her movement, several rising to their feet, their attention sharp and focused despite their earlier exhaustion. The massive wolf rose as well, moving with a fluid grace that belied the near-fatal weakness he had displayed only hours earlier. He positioned himself between Mara and the rest of the pack, close enough that she could see her own reflection in his dark, intelligent eyes. For a long moment they simply regarded each other, human and wolf bound together by an experience neither could fully explain in words. Then, slowly, deliberately, the massive wolf lowered his head toward her, a gesture that felt unmistakably like gratitude, before straightening once again and turning his attention toward the forest beyond the clearing. Mara understood, without knowing exactly how she understood it, that something significant had passed between them during the long and dangerous night. She had saved 12 lives from the freezing river, but she suspected now, watching the massive wolf's deliberate and measured movements, that the last of those lives carried a significance far beyond anything she had originally imagined. Whatever legends the local trackers had shared about an extraordinary wolf ranging through the deepest parts of the territory, Mara was beginning to believe she had found herself face to face with the very creature those stories had always described. She closed her notebook slowly, tucking it back into her coat pocket, and allowed herself a moment simply to sit with the strangeness of the morning. Around her, the pack had begun to stir more actively, several of the younger wolves engaging in brief, playful bouts of wrestling in the snow, their earlier exhaustion apparently fading with the returning daylight. The massive alpha watched these displays with what Mara could only describe as patient tolerance, occasionally issuing a low sound that seemed to settle the younger animals whenever their play grew too rough or too loud. It was a side of wolf behavior she had read about extensively in academic papers throughout her career, the complex social bonds and communication patterns that governed pack life, yet had rarely witnessed so clearly or so intimately in the field. Most of her professional encounters with wild wolves involved brief, distant observations through binoculars or camera traps, never anything close to this extended, direct proximity that circumstance had thrust upon her. She found herself grateful, despite the exhaustion and danger of the previous night, for the rare opportunity to witness such behavior firsthand. Few researchers, she suspected, had ever been granted this kind of access to an intact, functioning wolf family, let alone one led by an individual as extraordinary as the massive alpha resting so calmly beside her. The old scarred female approached at one point, moving with the same careful deliberation Mara had noticed the night before, and settled a short distance away, close enough to observe but not so close as to seem threatening. Mara met her gaze steadily, remembering the strange, evaluating look the wolf had given her during the rescue, and wondered again what judgment the animal had reached in that moment. Whatever conclusion she had drawn, her continued presence nearby suggested it had not been an unfavorable one. As the sun climbed higher behind the thinning clouds, Mara began preparing mentally for the difficult journey still ahead of her. She needed to reach the outpost, to report what had happened, to seek treatment for her lingering exhaustion, and the mild frostbite she suspected marked several of her fingers. But some part of her, quiet and unexpected, found herself reluctant to leave this strange, temporary sanctuary she had built among the pack, uncertain when or if she would ever again witness something so remarkable in the whole of her career. By early afternoon, the storm had finally broken completely, leaving behind a landscape transformed into gleaming white silence. Sunlight reflected sharply off the fresh snow, and the Kessler River, once a churning mass of dark water and broken ice, had begun to still, its surface slowly reforming a fragile skin of ice across the areas where the current ran slowest. Mara knew she needed to return to the outpost as soon as possible. Her body had endured hours of extreme cold and physical exertion, and though adrenaline had carried her through the worst of the crisis, she recognized the signs of delayed exhaustion beginning to settle deep into her muscles and bones. She needed proper rest, dry clothing, and likely medical attention to ensure the mild frostbite she suspected on her fingers did not develop into something more serious. She gathered her few scattered belongings, including the rope and the small emergency fire kit that had proven so essential throughout the long night, and prepared to begin the difficult walk back toward her cabin. It was then that she noticed something that stopped her in her tracks entirely. The 12 wolves had not scattered into the surrounding forest as she expected them to do once the immediate danger had passed. Instead, they remained gathered nearby, watching her with an attentiveness that felt deliberate rather than coincidental. As she took her first steps toward the ridge leading back to her outpost, the wolves began to move as well, falling into a loose formation that kept pace with her own careful progress through the deep snow. At first, Mara assumed the pack was simply moving in the same general direction by chance, perhaps returning to familiar territory that happened to overlap with her own path. But as she continued walking, glancing occasionally over her shoulder to confirm what she was witnessing, she realized the wolves maintained a consistent distance from her, neither closing in nor falling behind, matching her pace with what appeared to be deliberate intention. The massive wolf walked near the center of the group, his powerful frame moving with renewed strength despite the ordeal he had survived only hours earlier. Occasionally, his dark eyes would find hers across the distance separating them, and each time, Mara felt an unmistakable sense of communication passing between them, though she could not have explained in words exactly what that communication conveyed. She continued her slow trek up the ridge, her legs aching with every step through the deep, fresh snow, and the pack continued their careful escort behind and around her. It was an experience unlike anything Mara had encountered in all her years of wildlife work, one that defied easy explanation or comparison to anything she had previously witnessed or studied. Partway up the ridge, she paused to catch her breath, her exhausted body demanding a brief moment of rest before continuing the difficult climb. The wolves paused as well, settling into the snow at a respectful distance, watching her with patient, alert eyes as she recovered her strength. Mara took the opportunity to study them more closely, comparing their current calm and orderly behavior to the panic and chaos she had witnessed the night before. It was almost impossible to reconcile the two versions of these same animals, the desperate, drowning creatures fighting for survival in the freezing river, and the composed, disciplined pack now surrounding her with quiet, watchful patience. She thought again of the old stories shared by local trackers, tales of an exceptional wolf whose presence commanded unusual respect and whose territory stretched across some of the most remote and inaccessible regions of the province. She had always considered such stories interesting but ultimately unreliable, the kind of local color that added flavor to conversations without holding any real scientific weight. Now, watching the massive wolf resting calmly among his pack, his dark eyes occasionally finding hers with an intensity that felt almost human in its depth, Mara found herself reconsidering everything she thought she understood about the wildlife she had dedicated her career to studying and protecting. She pushed herself upright once more, her muscles protesting every movement, and continued her climb toward the ridge. The pack rose with her, resuming their careful formation, and together they made their way through the snow-covered forest, an unlikely procession of one exhausted woman and 12 enormous wolves, moving steadily toward the distant outline of her cabin. As they crested the ridge, Mara caught her first glimpse of the outpost in the distance, its familiar shape a welcome sight after the harrowing night she had survived. She quickened her pace slightly, eager now for the warmth and safety her cabin promised, and the pack adjusted their movement accordingly, maintaining their careful distance despite her increased speed. They continued together until the tree line thinned enough to reveal the full clearing surrounding her cabin. Here, at the edge of the forest, the pack finally slowed, and Mara understood instinctively that this was as far as they intended to accompany her. She stopped walking as well, turning to face the 12 wolves who had shared such an extraordinary night with her. The massive wolf stepped forward slightly, separating himself from the rest of the pack, and regarded her with those same intelligent, penetrating eyes that had unsettled and fascinated her throughout the morning. Mara held his gaze, unwilling to look away despite every instinct urging caution in the presence of such a powerful and unpredictable creature. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, deliberately, the massive wolf lowered his head in what Mara could only interpret as a final gesture of acknowledgement, before turning and leading his pack back toward the safety of the deep forest they called home. Mara watched them go until the last of the 12 wolves disappeared into the tree line, swallowed by shadows and distance until no trace remained of the extraordinary encounter she had just experienced. Only then did she turn back toward her cabin, her exhausted body finally allowing itself to acknowledge the full weight of everything she had endured throughout the long and unforgettable night. She had no way of knowing, as she trudged the final distance toward her warm and waiting cabin, that the story of her encounter with the massive wolf was far from finished. The connection formed during those desperate hours beside the freezing river had planted something that would continue to grow and reveal itself in the months that followed, in ways she could not yet begin to imagine. Reaching her cabin at last, Mara pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped into the welcoming warmth of a space she had not expected to see again during the worst hours of the previous night. She allowed herself a long moment simply standing in the doorway, absorbing the reality of her own survival, before finally moving to build a proper fire in her stove and shed the soaked, freezing clothing that had clung to her skin for what felt like an eternity. As warmth slowly returned to her battered body, she found her mind replaying the events of the night in fragments, disjointed images of dark water and thrashing limbs, of golden and amber eyes watching her with an intelligence she still struggled to fully comprehend. She thought of the old scarred female's careful evaluating gaze, of the young wolf's desperate thrashing calmed by nothing more than a steady voice speaking into the storm, and most of all, of the massive alpha's deliberate, unmistakable gesture of acknowledgement before he had turned to lead his pack back into the wilderness. She made herself a simple meal, her hands still trembling slightly from exhaustion and lingering cold, and ate slowly, methodically, aware that her body needed the fuel more than her mind needed to process the strangeness of what she had witnessed. Sleep, when it finally came, arrived suddenly and completely, pulling her under with a force she had no strength left to resist. She would wake many hours later to sunlight streaming through her cabin windows, the storm entirely past, the world outside transformed into a landscape of pristine, gleaming white that gave no outward indication of the chaos and desperation that had unfolded along the riverbank only a day before. Yet Mara knew, even in those first disoriented moments of waking, that something fundamental had shifted within her during that long and impossible night, a change she suspected would continue to unfold in ways she could not yet begin to fully understand. 3 days passed before the relay tower was repaired and communication with the outside world finally returned to the remote outpost. Mara spent that time recovering slowly from her ordeal, treating the mild frostbite on her fingers and resting her exhausted body as best she could within the confines of her small cabin. When her radio finally crackled back to life, she wasted no time reporting the extraordinary events of that stormy night to her regional supervisor, a careful and measured man named Gareth Doyle, who had overseen wildlife operations throughout the territory for nearly 2 decades. Gareth listened to her account with obvious skepticism at first, questioning details and requesting clarification on points that seemed, even to Mara herself, difficult to fully believe in the calm light of ordinary conversation. It was one thing to have lived through such an experience, surrounded by the desperate reality of drowning wolves in freezing water. It was quite another to describe that same experience to someone who had not witnessed it firsthand. Yet as she detailed the size of the pack, the unusual discipline and social structure she had observed, and particularly the extraordinary size and bearing of the 12th wolf she had pulled from beneath the ice, Gareth's tone shifted from skepticism to genuine interest. He mentioned that he too had heard scattered rumors over the years about an unusually large wolf ranging through the deepest reaches of the territory, stories dismissed by most as exaggeration but occasionally supported by unconfirmed sightings from hunters and remote researchers. He arranged for a small team of wildlife biologists to visit the outpost the following week, hoping to gather additional evidence and perhaps locate the pack Mara had encountered during the storm. Mara agreed to guide them, both out of professional obligation and a personal desire to understand more fully the remarkable creature she had rescued from the freezing river. The research team spent several days combing through the territory surrounding the Kesla River, setting up remote cameras and searching for tracks or other evidence of the pack's continued presence. Mara led them to the location where the rescue had taken place, now calm and frozen solid beneath a fresh layer of undisturbed snow, giving little indication of the desperate struggle that had unfolded there only days earlier. It was one of the research team members, an experienced wildlife photographer named Callum Ashford, who finally captured the evidence that would confirm everything Mara had described. Reviewing footage from a remote camera positioned along a ridge overlooking a distant valley, Callum discovered clear images of an enormous wolf pack moving through the snow, led by an animal whose size and distinctive silver markings matched Mara's description precisely. The images spread quickly through wildlife research circles, drawing attention from biologists and conservationists across the region who had long speculated about the existence of such an exceptional animal without ever obtaining concrete proof. Local trackers and indigenous elders, including the same Ellis Hartley whose old stories Mara had recalled during her time with the pack, confirmed that the images matched decades of scattered oral history describing a wolf of unusual size and intelligence that had commanded respect and even reverence throughout generations of local wildlife observers. The wolf, researchers determined, represented the alpha of what appeared to be the largest and most stable wolf pack documented in the entire province, a family group that had somehow avoided significant human contact for years despite ranging across territory that bordered several remote settlements and research stations. His unusual size, likely the result of both genetics and an exceptionally long and successful life, combined with the sophisticated social structure he maintained among his pack, made him a subject of immediate and intense scientific interest. Mara found herself at the center of growing attention, as word of her rescue spread beyond the immediate research community. Journalists and documentary filmmakers reached out, eager to hear her first-hand account of the night she had pulled 12 wolves from the freezing river, unaware at the time that the largest among them represented one of the most significant wildlife discoveries the region had seen in decades. She approached the growing attention with characteristic caution, agreeing to share her story through official channels while declining most requests for extensive media appearances. Her primary concern remained the well-being of the pack itself, and she worked closely with the research team to ensure that any publicity surrounding the discovery would not compromise the safety or natural behavior of the wolves she had grown to respect so deeply during their brief but unforgettable encounter. Over the following weeks, the research team continued monitoring the pack from a respectful distance, gathering data that confirmed much of what Mara had already observed firsthand. The alpha wolf, now informally referred to by researchers and locals alike using the same name the old stories had always attached to him, continued to lead his pack with the same quiet authority and discipline Mara had witnessed during those desperate hours beside the river. What struck the research team most, beyond the wolf's remarkable size and the sophistication of his pack's social structure, was a pattern they began noticing in the months that followed the rescue. The pack's territory, once confined to the most remote and inaccessible regions of the wilderness, gradually began to include areas closer to Mara's own outpost, as though the animals had made a deliberate decision to remain within reach of the woman who had saved their lives during the storm. Mara noticed the pattern herself long before the research team confirmed it through their tracking data. She began catching occasional glimpses of the pack during her regular patrols, distant shapes moving through the tree line at the edge of her territory, always maintaining a respectful distance but never entirely absent from the periphery of her daily routine. She never approached them directly during these encounters, understanding instinctively that the trust built during that desperate night beside the freezing river existed within careful boundaries that neither she nor the wolves seemed inclined to test unnecessarily. But the awareness of their continued presence, watching over her territory much as she had once watched over their survival, brought a quiet comfort that Mara found difficult to fully articulate to anyone who had not shared in that extraordinary night. The connection formed between a solitary wildlife ranger and an extraordinary wolf pack during the worst storm the region had seen in a decade had become something far larger than either could have anticipated, a bond that continued to shape both their lives in ways that extended well beyond the immediate crisis that had first brought them together. Gareth Doyle, who had initially greeted her account with such open skepticism, became one of the strongest advocates for protecting the pack's territory from future development proposals that had long threatened to encroach on the region's most remote wilderness areas. He argued passionately, using Mara's detailed observations and the research team's confirming data, that the presence of such an exceptional and scientifically significant wolf family justified stronger conservation measures than the area had previously received. His efforts, combined with growing public interest following the release of Callum Ashford's remarkable photographs, eventually led to expanded protections for a significant stretch of territory surrounding the Kesla River, ensuring that the pack's habitat would remain undisturbed for years to come. Mara took quiet satisfaction in this outcome, understanding that her desperate actions during the storm had ultimately contributed to securing a safer future for the very animals she had risked everything to save. Ellis Hartley, the old tracker whose stories had first planted the seed of recognition in Mara's mind, visited the outpost personally once travel conditions improved enough to make the journey practical. He spent long hours with Mara, sharing additional details about the oral history surrounding the alpha wolf's lineage, stories passed down through generations of local families who had lived alongside this remarkable pack, without ever fully revealing its existence to the wider world. According to these accounts, the bloodline Mara had encountered stretched back further than anyone could precisely document, a succession of exceptional alphas whose size and intelligence had made them subjects of quiet reverence rather than fear among those who shared their territory. Ellis explained that local tradition held such wolves to be protectors of the wilderness itself, rare individuals whose presence signaled the health and balance of the entire ecosystem surrounding them. Mara listened to these stories with newfound appreciation, no longer dismissing them as simple folklore, but instead recognizing the careful, accumulated wisdom of generations who had observed and respected these animals long before modern science arrived to document what they already understood. She found herself grateful for the opportunity to bridge these two forms of knowledge, the rigorous data collection of contemporary wildlife research, and the patient, observational wisdom passed down through decades of careful local tradition. Nearly a year passed before Mara fully understood the extent of what had changed since that stormy night beside the Kesla River. Her work at the remote outpost continued much as it always had, filled with quiet patrols, careful wildlife monitoring, and the steady rhythm of seasons shifting across the wilderness she had come to call home. Yet beneath that familiar routine, something fundamental had shifted, both in how she viewed her surroundings and in how the wilderness itself seemed to regard her presence. The research team's ongoing observations had revealed remarkable details about the pack's continued behavior throughout the following months. The alpha wolf, whose extraordinary rescue had first drawn scientific attention to the family group, continued to lead his pack with the same quiet discipline Mara had witnessed during their initial encounter, but researchers noted something additional in his behavior, a pattern that seemed to defy simple explanation through typical wolf territorial habits. Time and again, tracking data showed the pack deliberately maintaining proximity to areas where Mara conducted her regular patrols, not close enough to risk direct contact, but near enough that their paths crossed with a frequency that seemed unlikely to result from mere coincidence. Researchers began referring to the phenomenon informally as a kind of watchful companionship, an unusual arrangement between wild animals and a single human that defied easy categorization within established behavioral science. Mara experienced this quiet companionship most directly during her solitary patrols through the deepest parts of her territory. She would catch occasional glimpses of familiar shapes moving through distant tree lines, the massive silver-marked alpha unmistakable even from a distance, accompanied by pack members she had come to recognize individually through months of careful, respectful observation. One particular afternoon in early spring, nearly 11 months after the storm that had first brought them together, Mara found herself facing a dangerous situation of her own during a routine patrol. A sudden ice storm caught her unprepared far from her cabin, the treacherous conditions eerily reminiscent of the night that had changed everything for her and the wolf pack she had rescued. As she navigated carefully back toward safety through worsening conditions, she became aware of movement paralleling her own path through the trees. Glancing sideways through the blowing snow, she caught sight of the massive alpha wolf, keeping pace at a careful distance, his presence a silent but unmistakable companion throughout the difficult journey back to her outpost. She never confirmed with certainty whether his presence that afternoon represented deliberate protection or simple coincidence, the kind of overlapping paths that had become increasingly common between her patrols and the pack's territory. But something in the wolf's steady, deliberate pace beside her own struggling progress through the storm felt entirely too purposeful to dismiss as mere chance. She made it back to her cabin safely that evening, and though she never saw the pack directly during the remainder of that particular storm, She found herself thinking often in the following days about the strange symmetry of their continued relationship. She had once pulled this same extraordinary creature from certain death in a freezing river, and now, months later, he seemed determined to ensure she faced no similar danger without some measure of unseen support from the pack she had once saved. She mentioned the encounter briefly to Gareth during her next scheduled radio check, careful to describe it factually without overstating what she could not fully prove. He listened with the same open curiosity he had developed over the preceding months, noting the observation for the ongoing research file without pressing her for interpretations she was not prepared to offer. Between the two of them, an unspoken understanding had developed regarding the pack, one that valued careful documentation over hasty conclusions, yet left room for the quiet wonder that neither of them could entirely set aside. Word of the continuing bond between the solitary ranger and the extraordinary pack had, by then, spread well beyond the immediate research community. Mara received occasional letters from strangers moved by accounts of that night, some simply expressing admiration for her courage, others asking earnest questions about wolves and wilderness and the nature of trust between species that so rarely crossed paths peacefully. She answered what she could, always careful to protect the pack's precise location and to discourage any notion that their story invited curious visitors into territory that deserved to remain undisturbed. Callum Ashford returned to the region twice more over the following year, each time capturing further images that confirmed the pack's continued health and stability under the Alpha's steady leadership. He shared copies of his favorite photographs with Mara, including one that she kept pinned above her small desk at the outpost, an image of the massive wolf standing at the edge of a distant ridge, his silver-marked head turned slightly toward the camera, as though aware of being watched and entirely unconcerned by it. She looked at that photograph often during quiet evenings at the cabin, remembering the desperate hours of that first encounter, the exhaustion and fear and stubborn determination that had carried her through a night she still sometimes struggled to fully believe she had survived. Each time she felt a quiet, grounding gratitude, not simply for her own survival, but for the rare and extraordinary privilege of having played a part, however small, in the continued story of a pack whose history stretched back further than any single human life could measure. The research team's final published findings, released nearly a year after the initial rescue, confirmed what local trackers and indigenous communities had long suspected through generations of careful observation. The alpha wolf represented not simply an unusually large individual, but the culmination of a bloodline that had maintained dominance over the region's most significant wolf territory for multiple generations, passing leadership down through a careful and deliberate succession that few outside the immediate research community had ever fully documented. Mara read through the completed research with a quiet sense of satisfaction, understanding that her instinctive decision to brave the storm that fateful night had contributed something meaningful to the broader understanding of wildlife behavior in the region. But beyond the scientific significance of the discovery, she carried with her a personal understanding that no published paper could ever fully capture. She thought often about that desperate night beside the freezing river, about the exhausting hours spent pulling wolf after wolf from the churning water, never suspecting until the very end that the final and most difficult rescue would reveal itself to be the leader of an entire dynasty. She thought about the old female wolf who had studied her so carefully before finally accepting help, about the young panicked wolf whose trust she had earned through patient, steady words spoken into the howling wind, and most of all, about the massive alpha whose dark, intelligent eyes had watched her with such quiet understanding throughout that unforgettable morning after the storm finally passed. As the seasons continued to turn and her work at the remote outpost carried on, Mara found herself settling into a quiet appreciation for the unusual companionship that had grown between her and the wolf pack she had once saved from certain death. She never sought to interfere with their wild nature, never attempted to force contact beyond the occasional distant glimpses that continued to punctuate her solitary patrols. But she carried with her always the memory of that extraordinary night, and the quiet understanding that somewhere in the vast wilderness surrounding her outpost, 12 wolves who owed their lives to her desperate courage continued to watch over the territory they shared together, connected by a bond forged in the freezing waters of the Kesla River that neither species had ever expected to form. The story of that night became something of a quiet legend throughout the region, shared among rangers and researchers and local communities alike, a reminder of the unexpected connections that could form between the human world and the wild one, when courage and compassion met in the most desperate of circumstances. And for Mara Whitlock, the memory remained not just a story to be told, but a living reality that continued to unfold with each passing season, carried forward by the silent, watchful presence of an alpha king and his pack. moving quietly through the wilderness they now shared with the woman who had once pulled them all from the edge of the freezing river.